Welcome to Clocked In, the podcast where work works for people, not the other way around. We're Kristen and Ashley, and every week we dive into what's really going on in today's workplaces. From hybrid headaches to hiring trends, culture clashes to quiet quitting. Whether you're an HR pro, a people manager, or just someone trying to make sense of your 9 to 5, we've got the conversations that matter and the strategies to help you build a better workplace. So grab your coffee, clock in, and let's get to work.
Welcome to this week's episode of Clocked In. We're your host. I'm Kristen.
And I'm Ashley.
This is our fourth episode of our Gen Z series. And so what we've talked about in the past is a little bit of what you can expect from Gen Z and some common characteristics for them. And so what we talked about are just some commonalities of, in general, that they don't want to work in teams and they really lack the face-to-face communication skills. And they're really connected to social media, which has really led to them talking in a more informal way that maybe we're now starting to see seep into the workplace. And this generation, more than any other one that I have ever seen, has created their own language. It's actually very impressive how many words they have created. But this all relates to today's episode of how to better communicate with Gen Z. So Ashley, how does Gen Z like to communicate?
Yeah, so when we think about Gen Z's communication, we're seeing some pretty rapid changes and deviations from what has always been considered maybe workplace norms. And so for one, this generation, because of them being digital natives, internet's been around for their entire lifetime, they are more comfortable using informal language, and they like the conciseness of things like messaging apps, DMs, text message, things like that, versus long drawn out conversations. And so that's definitely something to be aware of that's different and impacting workplace communication. So when we think about that for Gen Z, that means their preferred communication style is going to be in short bursts. So short messages instead of long paragraphs of text, for example. And they also tend to respond well to visuals. And that's because of the inundation that they've had of social media, and they're sometimes known as like the TikTok generation. And so just that constant scroll, new information, if it doesn't catch my attention really quickly, I'm moving on to the next thing. Just a lot of inputs into their minds and their eyeballs. And so that's impacting their workplace expectations and attention spans and how they're communicating and how they want to be communicated with as well. But I think it's interesting that research has found that this generation does sometimes like to meet face to face over some of those technology tools. But the struggle is that sometimes there's a lack of the communication skills to actually do that well. And so there's an opportunity here for leaders to coach Gen Z on what professionalism and the standards of the workplace are in a face-to-face setting, but also knowing that this generation really craves authenticity over formality sometimes. And that can be a struggle, especially for older generations, as they are seeing this new generation come into the workplace and kind of shaking up status quo and not following the rules, if you will, as they've maybe been for a long time, those established norms. And so to really connect with Gen Z, you need to focus on authenticity and not so much the formality side, but this communication style can be difficult to implement, especially in very rigid structures. But there are ways, even while respecting someone's authority and having more formal structures, that you can still be authentic and relatable and make those connections with Gen Z workers. And Kristen, I think you have an article for us to talk about related to Gen Z's communication styles in the workplace.
So this one is from deskberg.com, and it's titled Gen Z Communication Style, How to Grasp the Generation with the Briefest Attention Span. So kind of already hinting at what you talked about being the TikTok generation. I think they refer to them as the snack media generation, which I had never heard that term before, but instead of just taking a big meal of a lot of information, they're just bits and pieces of it. It also calls out that they are really focused on like multitasking. So a lot of times that's maybe why they like to take in information only a little bit at a time, because they're usually doing multiple things at once. But the article goes over to talk about a little bit of who they are, and exactly like you talked about, they're always scrolling, swiping, clicking, and so their brains are constantly moving from one thing to another, which can really make it difficult to communicate with Gen Z. And so they talk about, like, in written communication, that texting is the preferred choice for Gen Z, because it's quick and concise most of the time. But really, I think this might not work all the time during a business setting. So maybe if we swap out texting for like I am in this example, I am may be their preferred choice of communication in the workplace. But they do call out that even if you're using that tool, keep your messages short, which is probably a good rule for I am anyways, but don't send in paragraphs of information. Break it up. Even if you have a 4-sentence message, break it up into individual sentences that you're sending, and it'll help them a little bit. And then, just like you called out, that they are very visual people, which makes sense, but I don't know if I've ever really thought about it in that regards of using visuals to connect and communicate with Gen Z specifically. But one thing that comment that they made is that they really call out that respect matters a lot for this generation. And so a lot of times, even if they would prefer like text or online communication, they are still willing to meet in person, but they want to still feel like they're being respected and they're being heard if they're meeting in person. And it doesn't always mean that even if they're meeting in person with you, that they're going to use that formal and professional language. And so that may be a little bit of adjustment for some people. But really what they're looking for in a communication is transparency. So they want you to be open and honest and give that direct feedback. And I think we talked about that in a past episode as well. And again, like, being respected and being felt like they're being heard is really important to this group. Another one that I think was surprising to me is about the need for constant feedback. But in the article, they even have a quote of they're used to getting instant opinions when interacting with their online community, even when they're not asking for it. And for me, and Ashley, let me know like what you've seen. I think that last part of even when they're not asking for it, and maybe that's why, because they're used to just people online giving their opinions for everything. But it's always interesting to me when I read like they're really craving that feedback, but I don't often see them like asking for it as much as what it seems like they want that feedback, if that makes sense. But what have you seen for that?
I've definitely seen and heard Gen Z complain about that, and just this expectation of wanting to know more how they're doing, and if they're doing well, what they're doing well, how they can improve. But yeah, really kind of lacking a lot of times the skill around soliciting feedback and then using it as that learning opportunity. And I think about how with social media, anytime you post something, you're getting the feedback in the form of likes or shares or comments or interactions like that. And so if you are growing up in that kind of environment, that is shaping the way that you expect communication to take place. And I think too, one other thing that you called out with this generation especially is this desire for mutual respect. And I think that's a basic human trait as well, but I think with Gen Z especially, it's this idea almost of like being treated as an equal. And that's really going to cause some tension in the workplace, especially if it's a very hierarchical structure or very formal structure. And so you have new employees coming in fresh to the company, and then they're wanting good feedback. They're wanting to be heard. They're wanting their opinions to count. They're wanting to be seen as an equal and treated with mutual respect. And like, there's a basic human decency level of respect, sure. But I think this is one of the challenges that Gen Z is facing as they're entering the workforce more and more, is this, I want to be seen as an equal. And that means I have equal footing, even though I'm new. And sure, there's ways that you can invite people into conversations and hear ideas and things like that. But the idea that you get equal footing as someone who has been there for a long time, and maybe your manager or your supervisor, like that is a struggle for communication in the workplace, because you have these thinking that they can come in and just that the structure will adapt to them more so than them having to adapt to the structure sometimes.
Yeah, and one thing that you said there that kind of triggered a thought for me is that they just expect for their ideas maybe to be treated as equal. But if we know that they desire that feedback, then maybe managers could use that as a feedback opportunity. So thinking about it in the way of like if Gen Z, you're brainstorming ideas, being open to their ideas, and instead of just dismissing them or saying like we're not going to go with that, use that for a feedback opportunity to say, this is a good idea. Thank you for sharing, but here's why it maybe won't work in this case. Because then I think that'll help them learn not only when to feel comfortable with speaking, and it may be very well how they presented their idea, right? And so you can give them the feedback on next time, let's present it this way, but then you're helping them build those skills and learn more. So their next idea will be even better. So I think that was a great point that you called out.
I think too the desire for transparency is kind of tricky in the workplace sometimes. So with Gen Z wanting these genuine relationships with colleagues and to feel like supported and that they're contributing, but then they also want full transparency from their company and from their supervisors. And that's just not always the case in the workplace. There's some people that for a certain time, for certain reasons, may not have the full story, or it hasn't been shared broadly yet. And so that can kind of break down some trust sometimes, even though it's for many people, they would think, well, that's just the way it works, right? Like those in higher positions are going to have more information. They're going to have more transparency than those in more entry level positions. But I think this could really be a struggle for Gen Z that they have to navigate as they're entering the workplace, because leaders, yes, they should communicate honestly with their employees, but how much, right? How much can they communicate? When can they be fully transparent? I'm thinking about people we know that are in industries that are very volatile and maybe facing layoffs or things like that. And so there is this kind of eroding trust, I think, in the workplace anyway. But I think Gen Z's desire for transparency is going to make that harder because they're going to see it as the communication isn't open. It's not a trustworthy organization because they're not telling me everything. They're not being fully transparent. And so I think that's something that companies and managers need to keep in mind with communicating with Gen Z.
Yeah, and you hit on a great point that the next article from Forbes calls out about tips on how to communicate with Gen Z. And one of them is to prioritize transparency and honesty. And anytime I hear that, and we were kind of talking offline about this, is I always think like, but if they're known for being a non-resilient generation, like how do you deliver that truth to them in that way that they want to hear? And I think this article does a good job of kind of answering that. And they actually say that Gen Z doesn't tend to display significant fragility, which kind of seems opposite of other research actually, but it says rather they simply want to hear the unvarnished truth spoken kindly. So I think that may be a clear way that managers can say, okay, I know that you want transparency and honesty, but maybe we have to really focus on softening the message for this audience. And then you said something else that that this article highlighted as well. I think along with like the transparency and communication, the article calls out that they will interpret silence as a negative and they're more likely to assume that something is wrong. And they actually say that many Gen Z employees and colleagues expect to hear from their managers on a regular or daily basis. And when they don't, they are more likely to assume something's wrong. And so exactly like what you were saying, like about the transparency, if a company's not doing that, that may more negatively impact Gen Z than any other generation. But I feel like that's so insightful for managers to know is like a lot of times we're like, oh, we're not going to say anything because nothing is wrong, but they are going to interpret that as something is wrong. And I think that probably directly comes from that always being connected online, right? So they probably talk to the same people multiple times a day throughout the day. So that's an interesting one, I think.
Yeah, and then that desire for feedback really can reassure Gen Z that you're seeing them, right? That you're respecting their work and that desire for respect, that you're noticing what they're doing. And so it can work together. And it's just more of like, these are things that you need to be aware of as a leader that might be different from other generations. And then to know, regardless of whether or not you can meet the desire, right? Like you may decide that's not something we're going to do here, or I can't realistically do a daily check in with every single person that I'm managing or whatever. It's not about catering to Gen Z. It's more about being aware of what their expectations are so that you can either meet them or be aware that you're not meeting them and maybe have a conversation about why. So it's more of acknowledgement that this is something that you may be expecting, Gen Zer. However, in the workplace, that's not realistic. Or with the current workload, I can't do that. But at least you know that there's this kind of unspoken expectation that might be there in play.
Yeah, and I was thinking back to a past episode that we did that was talking about how a lot of Gen Zers, they don't have that work experience. And so if the only experience that they're bringing into the workplace is from a social act, then they may say, okay, I talk to my friends every day. I get constant feedback from them. My manager should be the same way. And so I think what you said is really key there of it's not always just about catering and adapting and making sure that you're checking in or hand holding Gen Z all the time, but make sure that you're being transparent in the expectations that you're setting to say, you know, I have an open door. You can come talk to me whenever you need to, but I cannot check in with you every single day. And it shouldn't be interpreted as a negative, but if you ever have any questions, feel free to, to ask me and encourage them to do that. But something else that you said as well kind of really aligns with the number one tip is, and I have kind of mixed feelings about this one, so you have to let me know what you think, of focusing on output, not behavior. And really the whole point of it is that even though Gen Z may seem like they're not paying attention or that they're multitasking or that they're on their phone, it doesn't mean that they're not working. And so you shouldn't be so focused on the fact that they're on their phone if they're still getting their work done. But like I said, I have mixed feelings about that. But what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I don't really agree with this point. I see the idea behind it, but my concern is that there are some things that are unprofessional in the workplace or that do need to be addressed. And that's the manager's responsibility to do that. And so, yes, output matters, but the behavior does too, because that's setting the culture for your group, for your team, for the way you work. And like at the end of the day, outcomes or outputs are important. But I think if you're not careful, it's just a slippery slope. And like maybe your team develops different norms or working behaviors, and like that's okay. For example, this one specifically was talking about if they're on their phone, it shouldn't be perceived as a problem. And I'm like, okay, maybe, but then it's like, where's the line, right? Like, where's the line between you're spending too much time on TikTok versus you're not doing your work? And I get it. It's saying focus on output, but I think it should be output and behavior, right? Like if you can get your job done faster, that's fine. But also the behavior does matter in the workplace, and it does project a certain professional or unprofessional persona. And so I think it needs to be both. I think output certainly matters. That's the job you're paid to do. But you can't just dismiss all behaviors because, what if, oh, well, this person's good at their job, but they want to wear their pajamas to work today kind of thing. Like, where's the line? Because maybe their clothes don't make a difference on how they're doing their job, but there's certainly an expectation around professionalism there that might be perceived differently.
I don't think you could have come up with a better example of a slippery a slippery slope there. But yeah, I was thinking back to the episode that we did about do you have to be seen to be heard? But this is one of those things, like even if you're getting your work done, your other coworkers may not know that you're getting your work done. Only your manager may know that you're getting your work done. And so if all that they see is you on your phone all the time, that's going to lead them to have a negative perception of you. And so I think that's a key takeaway for any Gen Z employees, is that perception does matter. And it may be just a matter of communicating, hey, I'm done with this. What else do I need to work on? And being more proactive of what else can I do versus just instantly getting back on your phone and not doing anything.
I think too, the authors called out a great point about this one with evaluating Gen Z or any employee for that matter on meaningful metrics. Right? And I think that's so key. What is it that you actually are expecting out of this role, and how can somebody succeed in this role? What does success look like in such a position? But I don't think you can excuse all behavior either. So for me, it's a mixed bag, but I don't agree that behavior is irrelevant.
Yeah, I agree. And then the next one is kind of to me as well, because it says use the channels that Gen Z feels comfortable with. And while I think it's good to know like what channels they prefer, sometimes it's just not practical. So like it calls out like while they like direct personal communication, they don't like phone calls. So like don't call Gen Z. But that may not always be the right move to do. You know, there's some, we talk about this in class, you have to choose the right channel for their message. There may be something that you need to do a face-to-face call or a phone call about instead of just sending a text message or putting it in writing, to be honest. So that one is kind of like, I don't feel like you can always cater to them on that one. One thing that I think is interesting is they say like while they're known for social media and their desire to use social media, that is for social reasons, that they don't want to talk to their boss and coworkers on social media, that they like to keep the two separate. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And then kind of along those lines, knowing like what's important to them. And we talked about work-life balance for this group and how a lot of times they're not willing to work past 5. And so to really honoring that boundary and showing that respect to them in that way, I think can help you. They're saying communicate better, which leads to the last one that they have is that one of the biggest fears for Gen Z employees is that their older colleagues don't respect them. They've grown up hearing they're lazy, emotionally fragile, and don't want to work. And they go to call out that that's not true. They're actually effective, efficient, and reliable team members. And so I think that just goes back to what you were saying at the beginning of them wanting that mutual respect. And so it's interesting to see that this is actually a fear of theirs going into the workplace. Did you have any thoughts on any of those last ones there?
I think when it comes to choosing how you communicate with Gen Z, I don't agree with the article that you should just go with whatever they feel most comfortable with, because as we talk with students about, it is important to think about what you're trying to communicate and what's the best mode to communicate that. So just because you may prefer to send a Slack message, sometimes instead of going back and forth with somebody, it's easier to just have the phone call or get on a Zoom call or, hammer something out, especially if you need a quick response or you're needing like more detailed information. And so, yes, recognize that there might be different comfort levels, but part of the workplace is that you also have to do things you're uncomfortable with technology wise too. So I may not prefer a phone call, but if my phone rings, I need to answer it or I need to reply to voicemails or things like that. And so I think it's fine to recognize a preference, but that doesn't mean that's the only method that should be or can be used. And so I think about things like, what is the culture of the organization? Are we heavily using Slack or Teams? Do we only use email? What are the kind of environment are we in? And there is a part of Gen Z needing to adapt to that as well. You can care not at all about email in your personal life, but if you want to be successful in the workplace, you're probably going to have to use email, right? So like recognizing it's a give and take. And I think that's the whole kind of conversation here around communicating with Gen Z employees, is that there may be things that are different about this generation as a whole that are changing workplace norms, but that doesn't mean that just because they want something that's what they get, right? So there is a give and take of them having to adapt to the workplace in the same way that the workplace is adapting to them, and kind of finding what is this middle ground, or what are the standards here, and just being direct and honest about that. And that's something that research continually shows about Gen Z, is wanting people to be honest and wanting them to be transparent. And so if you can be really direct or plain spoken, make it clear what your expectations are, then it's helpful all the way around, because people aren't having to guess or try to read between the lines. You've just kind of set the standard for the expectation.
Yeah, and I think another article that we have from Rake and Consulting, they call out a number of the things that you just said and that we've already talked about, like such as taking their suggestions. They prefer texting over phones. But one thing that they call out that we haven't talked about is like establishing digital office hours. And I think that goes back to the sense of like, if you don't hear from me, that they're gonna if they don't hear from you, they're going to think that something is wrong. So when I read that, I was like, that could maybe be a good answer to that, to say, let them know, even if it's not like, I don't know, I feel like it would be so difficult as a manager to say every day from 2 to 4, I'm going to be available online, but kind of creating that digital office hours type of field where Gen Zers can reach out if they have any questions. I thought that was an interesting one in theory, but maybe in applicability, not so much. But what do you think about that one?
Highlights the desire for feedback and maybe Gen Z's being a little bit resistant or uncomfortable to asking for it because it's like, well, I don't want to bother you. Even though a manager may say, well, my door's always open. It's like, but can I really just walk in and sit down and have this conversation with you? Or do I have to send an email to schedule an appointment time? Or what is that? So I think the idea is good about keeping an open door electronically for communication, but I do think that it would probably be very difficult to implement in all honesty. And so the better option may be just setting the expectation for all the employees of what your expectations are for them, but also how they can reach out and that you expect them to reach out if they have questions or to let you know, what issues they're having or stumbling blocks they're having to getting their work done. And like that, it's okay for you to be proactive on that from the employee side. I think that would go further than realistically being able to hold like a set office hours every time, being like blocked out in your calendar. I don't think that's probably going to work as effectively as it does in theory. But the idea behind it of being available, setting up time to get back with people to say, hey, if you have questions, let me know. Let's talk this through, I think is the key takeaway here.
Yeah. And as we were going through it, I kept thinking about, like, even if it is their preference or they don't like to do something, it doesn't mean that they can't do it. But again, we just have to realize that they may not have experience doing it. So we may need to teach them in the workplace to do these sort of things. I think which really leads us to then the final kind of key takeaways for managers and even colleagues, what they could do to better communicate with Gen Z. So what do you think for managers? What are some things that they can do to communicate more effectively with their Gen Z employees?
I think this works for all employees, not just Gen Z, but the key one would be to communicate in a way that's clear and direct. So be really straightforward with instructions. What are the next steps? Be specific. Who's assigned to what? What are the outcomes? Like, that can really help somebody understand what's the priority, what do they need to focus on, who's responsible for what. So just clear, direct communication can go a long way in helping set expectations and manage those expectations. Certainly, we've talked about this multiple times today and in other episodes as well, just the frequent feedback, being authentic, being transparent. And that doesn't mean, being authentic doesn't mean that you have to be unprofessional. You can still keep those boundaries between managers and subordinates, but you can be authentic and be genuine as a person and be transparent in your communication as you're able to do so, while recognizing that not every piece of information is able to be shared at every time, for all employees. I think as well, key takeaways for managers: respecting work-life boundaries. Again, not specific just to Gen Z, but be really conscious of when you're sending emails or when you're sending Slack messages, and then set those expectations. I've seen this on people's email signatures. I've seen it and I've heard it in conversations as well. But just this idea of, I'm sending this message when it's convenient for me, but there's no pressure for you to respond right away if it's outside of working hours. So I think having that, just kind of level setting that expectation, can go a long way, and then following through with it, because there is that sense of like, oh, if I have Slack on my phone and I see the message, now I need to check it, now I need to respond. And it's like, I think having a conversation and being realistic about what you're expecting is a good first step. But also, as the manager, recognizing that you are kind of setting a tone. And yes, you may tell somebody you don't have to respond right away after 5 o'clock, but like, if somebody's waking up in the morning to 50 text messages or 50 Slack messages from you, like during the night, like they're probably thinking, now I feel overwhelmed and I haven't even like logged in to start the day. And so just recognizing that those kinds of boundaries can be helpful, and like explicitly saying them and then following through on what you're actually saying, right? So just being genuine in that way can help build that mutual respect as well. And I think too, we've talked a lot about generations and how these elements are not true for every single person just because of when they were born. So if you want to get to know your employees better or how they prefer to communicate, have the conversation. That's the same with any generation. Like you'll find out that there's people, regardless of when they were born, that prefer certain forms of communication over others as a personality trait. Like some people just love to be on the phone, right? Like I want to talk to somebody. I want to see them, or if I'm face to face. And others that are like, I will send you the best email I can and I just would rather not pick up the phone. And so we're talking about trends, but that doesn't mean it applies to every single person.
Yeah, I think that's a really good call out because personality can dictate so much about communication styles, maybe even more than generational does. But I think there's a lot of key takeaways for employees and then for Gen Z specifically as well. I think a number of them that you talked about for managers would certainly apply to other employees and coworkers. I think a big one that coworkers have a really good opportunity to do is to really collaborate and ask for input from their Gen Z colleagues. And that maybe is something that managers, depending on the size of the team, can't do every day, but you as a coworker can, and that can help you build that trust and also help them learn as well. So I think for employees, along with just being friendly and professional, really taking the time to collaborate with them can go a long way with Gen Z. But for Gen Z, I think there's a few really good takeaways as well. The first being that, again, just because it's not something that you're comfortable with doesn't mean that you can't or shouldn't do it. So you can do hard things, as they say. And so it's really important to learn how to match whatever you're talking about to the message, but also know that you need to use professional tone. We talk about this in class about how you should never use slang when you're talking in a workplace to people, especially Gen Z, because my goodness, like I said at the beginning, they have a different word for everything. But it's really important that if you are a Gen Z employee in the workplace, to know that that can make you appear unprofessional and that you shouldn't use that language in the workplace, and that you will need to adapt to the different generations and to your managers and coworkers just as they will have to adapt to you. You should meet in the middle, and honestly, probably at the beginning of your career, you're going to do more adapting than people are adapting to you. As you start to build some trust and camaraderie with other people, you may have to really adapt to them. Anything else you have to add, Ashley?
I think about things like emojis and GIFs and like, is that okay in the workplace, and how much the culture of the company is going to impact that answer. And so I always say, just like if you're interviewing and you want to dress to impress, like you want to put your best foot forward, same way with the communication, like kind of side with a more professional demeanor, more professional tone. And then as you notice what's the culture like are people using emojis or exclamation points or things like that, then you can introduce those into more of your like peer interactions, so to speak. But thinking through it as, how can I put my best foot forward and portray the best, most professional version of myself? And then I can learn whether or not some of the more casual things can be done in this workplace, because it really will depend on the culture. And like, are you communicating with coworkers versus clients versus management? Like it does change what's kind of that professional tone expectation. And I think that it's important, as you called out, like the Gen Z kind of flexing more towards the other generations. I think that is a good thing to call out, in that you as Gen Z will have to adapt, and that can make you stand out as being more professional, as being adaptable, because you are putting forth this professional persona and it's reflecting well on you, and people see that you're aiming to work well with colleagues across generations, and you're not just hanging out with other Gen Zers, you're not just acting like it's a group of friends and using the same language. Like you're setting yourself apart by choosing to use more professional behavior, more professional words. And so I think that's one important thing for Gen Z. And another one is like the hierarchies exist, and whether you want them to or not, that's the reality of most workplaces today, is that there are hierarchies. So you need to learn how to share your ideas and ask questions in a respectful and professional way. And so part of that is learning who makes decisions. How does communication flow in your organization? Like, who are those key players? But also, when is it time to speak up and in what settings? Right? Like some cultures, some workplaces, it's like you've got to kind of earn your right to contribute to a conversation. Or in some, it might be like, oh, it's good to share ideas with your manager, but if we're in a broader team meeting, like, don't be speaking out of turn. Like, it's just a very delicate balance to watch and observe to kind of learn what the norms are. And I think that's something that fresh to their career individuals sometimes struggle with, to see that maybe I don't just speak up in every single meeting because I haven't, quote, earned the right to do so, so to speak.
Yeah, I agree. I think that those are all really great. And I think we could do a whole episode in and of itself on nonverbal cues for Gen Z and their well-known Gen Z stare. So maybe we can save that for another time. But I do think it is very important for them to be mindful of how they're communicating, even in a nonverbal way, and how they can be perceived by other people in their organization. But I think that just about wraps us up for this episode. So what are our next steps with the series and the freebie that we have for our listeners?
First, we want to hear from you, the listeners. So let us know what's one communication habit that you wish Gen Z would pick up, and what's one that you wish older generations would let go of. So as we talked about this kind of meeting in the middle, what's something you wish Gen Z would do, and what's something you wish other generations would stop doing? And then we want you to connect with us. So we have a freebie for you, like Kristen mentioned. We have a free guide called Managing Gen Z Without Losing Your Mind. It's a quick start guide. You can get that in the link in the show notes below. Be sure to subscribe, follow along. If this information resonated with you, share it. This concludes our 4-part series on Gen Z and the workplace. So in addition to our free guide, we're also working on some additional content and training resources for you. So be sure to grab the free guide so that you'll be in the loop for future training opportunities related to how to manage Gen Z and the changes that they're bringing to the workforce. So that's it for today's episode. Thanks for joining us for Clocked In. We're clocking out, and we'll see you next time.